There is a moment in every geopolitical confrontation when the architecture of restraint begins to crack, when the language of diplomacy gives way to the grammar of military force. For Iran and the United States, that moment did not arrive without warning. It arrived after years of calculated pressure, missed opportunities, broken agreements, and the slow, grinding accumulation of strategic grievances. What unfolded from early 2025 through the opening weeks of 2026 represents one of the most consequential chapters in modern American foreign policy, a chapter still being written with no clear final page in sight. When Donald Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, he inherited what many analysts described as a historic window of opportunity. Iran entered that year weaker than at any point since the 1979 revolution. Its economy was buckling under the weight of U.S. sanctions and mismanagement. Its regional proxy network had been significantly degraded by the fall of Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad and by Israel's decisive campaigns against Hezbollah and Hamas. The regime in Tehran was encircled, economically, militarily, and politically. Washington held real leverage. The question was not whether the United States had power. The question was how that power would be wielded and at what cost. Trump moved quickly. Within weeks of taking office, he reinstated a maximum pressure campaign designed to push Iran into a new nuclear agreement, prevent its development of nuclear weapons, and counter its regional influence. The message from the White House was unambiguous. Trump declared he would not tolerate an Iranian nuclear weapons capability. His team made clear that all options were on the table. These were not idle threats. They were the opening moves in a long and dangerous game. Trump also pledged to reduce Iran's oil exports to zero, a declaration that sent immediate shockwaves through global energy markets and put every nation doing business with Tehran on notice. The structure of this pressure campaign rested on a foundation of intelligence assessments that had grown increasingly alarming. In December 2024, the UN nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, had reported Iranian enrichment to levels approaching weapons grade. It found an unprecedented stockpile of highly enriched uranium without a credible civilian purpose, giving Iran the capacity to produce enough fissile material for multiple bombs on short notice. The program had also received external assistance. North Korea had supplied both missiles and uranium. The clock, by every credible estimate, was running down. In January 2025, the exiled opposition group, the National Council of Resistance of Iran, alleged that Iran was developing long-range missiles under the IRGC with ranges up to 3,000 kilometers. The strategic threat was not theoretical. It was material, measurable, and accelerating. Against this backdrop, on March 7, 2025, Trump announced that he had written a letter to Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei expressing his desire to initiate new nuclear negotiations. He warned that failure to accept the proposal could expose Iran to serious military consequences. Diplomacy, it seemed, still had a role to play, if only briefly. On April 12, 2025, Iran and the United States began a series of negotiations aimed at reaching a nuclear peace agreement. The first round of high-level meetings was held in Oman, led by U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. A second round took place in Rome on April 19th. A third followed in Muscat. For a moment, the world watched with cautious hope. The diplomatic channel was open, but it would not remain open for long. Trump had set a 60-day deadline. The talks proceeded with what both sides called constructive engagement, but the underlying demands were incompatible. Iran refused to permanently surrender its enrichment capabilities. The United States insisted on nothing less. When the deadline passed without an agreement, the architecture of restraint gave way entirely. Beginning on June 13, 2025, Israel struck multiple targets across Iran with the stated goal of preventing Iran from developing nuclear weapons. The United States followed. Key Iranian nuclear facilities were struck from the air. The strikes were extensive and technically sophisticated. The world had entered a new phase, one from which there would be no easy return. On June 12, 2025, the IAEA found Iran non-compliant with its nuclear obligations for the first time in 20 years. Iran dismissed the resolution as politically motivated and declared plans to build a new enrichment site and install advanced centrifuges. The strikes had not broken Tehran's resolve. If anything, they had hardened it. Iran struck back at a U.S. military base in Qatar. The conflict had spread beyond any single theater of operation. The Middle East was no longer a region bracing for war. It was a region at war. Yet even after those June 2025 strikes, the nuclear question refused to die. Trump later said that Iran's rulers had continued their pursuit of a nuclear weapon even after U.S. forces obliterated their key nuclear sites. He pointed to a new construction effort at a different site, believed to be near the Natanz complex, buried as deep as 100 meters beneath a mountain of granite. The message was sobering. Airstrikes alone could not eliminate nuclear ambition. Every facility destroyed seemed to prompt the construction of a deeper, harder-to-reach replacement. IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi confirmed that roughly half of Iran's highly enriched uranium stockpile of 440 kilograms was stored in the Esfahan tunnels. That material, enough for multiple weapons, remained intact and unverified. The mission was far from complete. Then came February 28, 2026, a date that will be studied in war colleges and diplomatic seminars for decades. Spurred by fresh intelligence that Supreme Leader Khamenei was meeting with his top officials that morning, the U.S. and Israel accelerated their plans for a strike, hoping to eliminate the regime's senior leadership in a single blow. The logic was brutal but comprehensible. Remove the leadership, create a power vacuum, and fill it with figures more open to a U.S.-friendly arrangement. The first strike succeeded in killing Khamenei and other high-ranking aides, but as early reports came in, a new problem emerged. Most of the candidates the administration had identified to lead a post-Khamenei Iran had also been killed. Most of the people we had in mind are dead, Trump acknowledged days later. It was the first sign that a campaign designed as a focused, surgical operation was spiraling into something far more open-ended and far more dangerous. Instead of rapid collapse, the Iranian regime consolidated control and responded more aggressively than U.S. officials had anticipated, firing on targets across the Middle East, including oil tankers. Iran effectively halted the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz, sparking a global energy crisis. Markets turned jittery. Through the Strait of Hormuz flows approximately 20% of the world's oil supply. The choke point had become a weapon, and Iran was using it with precision. By mid-March 2026, the United States had spent $12 billion on its war against Iran since launching joint strikes on February 28th. According to Trump's top economic advisor, Kevin Hassett. More than $5 billion in munitions alone was spent in the first week. The human cost was also mounting. At least 444 people had been killed in Iran since strikes began. 13 U.S. soldiers had been killed and more than 140 had been wounded. The fighting had spread to Lebanon, and Gulf countries continued to face repeated Iranian drone strikes. The war had broadened, and no one could say with confidence where its boundaries lay. The economic fallout was rattling the globe. With the Strait of Hormuz emerging as a major choke point, oil prices were climbing despite producers releasing reserves. The conditions that typically produce short wars, a decisive military advantage, an adversary willing to negotiate, and a clear political endgame, were conspicuously absent. Within the administration itself, the uncertainty was palpable. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth sought to advance a set of clearer goals for the conflict, eliminating Iran's ability to develop and launch ballistic missiles, destroying its navy, and wiping out its nuclear capability. But Trump repeatedly contradicted them when pressed, raising questions as to whether any of his top aides truly had a handle on how the coming weeks would play out. Some officials close to Trump were said to have buyer's remorse, growing fears that attacking Iran had been a strategic mistake. A source close to the administration described a president who had dismissed caution in the final decision. He ended up saying, "I just want to do it," the source said. He grossly overestimated his ability to topple the regime short of sending in ground troops. These are the admissions that echo through history. The quiet acknowledgments that a plan has outrun its assumptions, that the map no longer matches the territory. The stakes for U.S. allies have never been higher. European powers have failed to condemn Trump's military action, exposing what critics call a double standard in how Western nations respond to conflicts in the Middle East and the Global South. Traditional alliances with Europe have been strained. The United Nations has been undermined. International law experts have questioned whether the post-World War II global order is functionally operative when the world's most powerful nation chooses to ignore it. The Gulf states, those same nations that depend on the Strait of Hormuz for their economic lifeblood, have found themselves caught between Washington's demands and the existential consequences of regional war. They are allies of the United States, and they are watching their own infrastructure threatened by Iranian retaliation they did not invite. Israel, for its part, wants regime change in Iran and more dramatic military destruction, a goal that diverges in scope and ambition from what many in Washington claim to have envisioned at the outset. The divergence between American political messaging and Israeli operational expectations has introduced a layer of strategic incoherence into the conduct of the war itself. Israeli military and political leaders have signaled a far less optimistic assessment of the timeline, suggesting that degrading Iran's military capabilities would require sustained operations. The coalition conducting this war is not unified. It is a coalition of overlapping interests, diverging timelines, and competing definitions of victory. Whether Trump ultimately becomes the most consequential U.S. president on Iran since Jimmy Carter, or merely an accelerant of regional instability, will hinge on whether his administration can move beyond improvisation and develop a coherent strategy. The variables are staggering. Iran has demonstrated an ability to absorb military punishment while preserving the capacity to inflict economic pain on the world. It has continued nuclear activity even after its key sites were struck. It has closed the strait. It has killed American soldiers. And it has done all of this without a supreme leader, led now by a reconstituted regime whose character and decision-making calculus remain deeply unclear to American intelligence. Trump posted on Truth Social that Iran is totally defeated and wants a deal, but not a deal that I would accept. The war is entering its third week. The Tomahawk missiles have been fired. The Ayatollah is dead. 13 Americans have not come home. $12 billion has been spent. And the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow blue corridor through which the modern world's economy breathes, remains in dispute. This is not the end of the story. This is the moment where history pauses, looks at the wreckage of assumptions, and asks the question that no leader in Washington or Jerusalem or Tehran has yet managed to answer with conviction. What does victory actually look like? And is anyone still capable of achieving it?